Like any Batman story, this one is about redemption. Batman and Robin is a 1997 movie adaptation of the DC Comics property of the same name. The movie has been critically scrutinized ever since its release, though now I feel that there's a new appreciation among fans. In this video, I will be reviewing the story, themes, and characters of 1997's Batman and Robin. Batman and Robin is the direct sequel to Batman Forever. Though I view Schumacher's Batman movies more anthological, like the Bond franchise, each movie more or less stands on its own as an independent story. Many of the cast and crew from the previous movie Batman Forever returned in Batman and Robin. Joel Schumacher is back in the director's chair. Akiva Goldsman is now the sole writer of the script, and actors Chris O'Donnell, Michael Gull, and Pat Hingle return in their respective roles. Val Kilmer would decline to return as Bruce Wayne/Batman. Schumacher and the studio agreed to cast George Clooney in the role. I think Clooney definitely had potential, though he was young in his career, so I don't think he offered the maturity that they were looking for in the character. For Mr. Freeze, they casted Arnold Schwarzenegger. A few of the other names that were considered were Ed Harris, Anthony Hopkins, and Patrick Stewart. I think either of them would have really elevated the character, though Arnold really plays with what he's got. They even rewrote the character of Freeze just to better suit him. Schumacher wanted Arnold, as he interpreted the character of Freeze, as the Terminator meets the refrigerator. Schumacher's interpretations of the source material in general is very artistically interesting. From his 90s punk Greco-Gothic Gotham City to the muscularly sculpted sheets of rubber, Schumacher made the adaptations his own. Uma Thurman was casted as Poison Ivy. I feel that she really understood the assignment. What she saw in Poison Ivy was very intriguing, and I think for the most part, she brought that onto screen. She transformed the character from this lonely, weak, helpless scientist to this mischievous, desirable, powerful femme fatale. The duality of her performance was excellently portrayed. I wasn't able to find much information about if there was an alternative pitch for this movie. I think it's because this time around the studio knew what kind of product they wanted. In Shadows of the Batman Unbound, the crew talks about how much pressure they were under. The audience wanted darker and grittier, while the studio wanted more family-friendly. In the end, the studio's desire to make a profit won over their desire to please the fans. Of course, I think studios or creators should obey the barbaric cravings of the fans. I also don't think studios should put money in front of passion. Art is nothing without integrity and balance. Tonal shifts of a franchise at the time can be very disorienting. Everyone involved knew what kind of movie they were making, what kind of story they were portraying on screen. The audience's anger comes from their own blind and forceful expectations of a project they have no control over. This furthering lack of control in their lives just leads to frustration. After 20 years, it's not easier to view this movie on its own, detach it from any expectations birthed from the previous installments. You can then view this movie as what it is, a fun watch and valid Batman movie. Art deserves to be viewed as intended and with respect, and this movie is certainly art. There were at least 2 pitches for a direct sequel to the movie, with George Clooney and Chris O'Donnell returning to their roles, Batman Unchained and Batman Dark Knight. Neither of course were picked up, as Batman and Robin failed to perform well enough to earn a sequel. Both scripts had promised a darker and more introspective Batman project. Batman Unchained had Schumacher involved with Mark Protasevic writing. The villains would have been Scarecrow and Harley Quinn, depicted as Joker's daughter. The two would use fear toxins to torment Batman, forcing him to confront the drug-induced hallucinations of his former villains. Batman Unchained seemed to be more aligned with Batman Forever rather than its immediate predecessor, an exploration of Batman's psychology, a topic Schumacher was so interested in and the reason he accepted the position in the first place. Batman Dark Knight was written with the exclusion of Schumacher by Lee Shapiro and Stephen Wise, seemingly inspired by Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. Clooney would be playing a reclusive and retired Bruce Wayne, with O'Donnell now portraying Dick as an independent college student who has distanced himself from Bruce. Scarecrow would be this story's antagonist as well, assisted by the Man-Bat. Scarecrow's crimes would force Bruce out of retirement to resume the mantle of Batman and to reconcile with his former Robin. There of course were many scripts between 1997's Batman and Robin and 2005's Batman Begins. The Batman property is a cow that Warner Bros. And DC will never stop milking. The opening perfectly sets the tone for the movie while also establishing the main characters and their relationships. The plot of Alfred being ill is well established. We see how Alfred has forced himself to put on a brave face while he's painfully ill. It parallels Bruce's duality between the charming, perfect Bruce Wayne and the broken, vengeful Batman. Bruce and Alfred are unwilling to be seen as human, even by the people they care about, not wanting to burden them with their own issues. Immediately, this movie feels like a comic book, heavily camp, exaggerated scenery, over-the-top performances, like an old The Brave and the Bold comic. The set design is so elaborate and vibrant, parts feel low budget, but that only adds to the campy, bulby aesthetic of the movie. Introduction to Mr. Freeze establishes him to be a confusing character. He matches the tone of the movie, but I think it would have been interesting if he just was a sharp contrast. Cold, isolated, emotionless, in such a vibrant, colorful world. Instead, he is very emotional, seemingly enjoying his villainous acts. Though he does have scenes where he is melancholy and ruthless, I think more focus on those scenes would have served the character better. Freeze's line, "Your emotions make you weak, that's why this day is mine," sets up the conflict between Bruce and Dick. Bruce is detached while Dick is still cocky and arrogant. He saves Dick only to immediately criticize him. An unbalanced father and son relationship. Ivy's introduction feels a bit random. They could have written her in with more narrative relevancy. Her plot and character seemingly inserts her into the story. No real connections between her and Freeze, only her vague desire for vengeance against Bruce Wayne. Perhaps she could have been researching plants as a possible solution to McGregor disease, just to have a shared plot thread between the three. The underlying theme of the movie that connects Ivy, Freeze, and Bruce is their hope in humanity, or lack thereof. Freeze has plans to hold the city ransom in order to afford to research a cure for his wife's disease. Nora is his anchor to humanity. Without her, he's a frozen husk of the man he once was. When Ivy tells Freeze that Nora was killed by Batman, he completely loses any hope he had for Nora. No longer needing to hold Gotham random, as he no longer has a reason to do research. His interest now is just genocide, making the world as cold as he is. I think this change would have been stronger if Freeze was hesitant and merciful with his crimes up until that point. just to really show how much Nora meant to him and how far he's fallen. Ivy was a devoted and slightly unhinged scientist. Her passion and purpose was the preservation of plant life. Any hope in humanity that she had died when she was attacked by her superior. She's been the victim of man's evilness and his animalistic impulses and desires. She then manipulates and capitalizes on these impulses and desires. She's an opportunist. Her influence lengthens the distance between Bruce and Dick. She deceives Freeze into completely destroying Gotham so that she can build her planned dystopia atop the world she's lost compassion for. Bruce sees Ivy as this temptation, a siren calling him to the darkness. Alfred has always been Bruce's tether to humanity. He fears what may become of the man he's raised if his illness claims him. The moments between Alfred and Bruce are beautiful. Alfred can't move on unless he knows that there is still hope for Bruce. He needs Bruce to know that Batman isn't all that he is. Bruce has his own fears. He fears for the future. His slow detachment from humanity has caused him to become harshly critical of Dick, causing a rift in the relationship. Dick's immaturity, naiveness, and inability to recognize his own faults has caused him to fall victim to Ivy's manipulation. Ivy represents corruption, the embodiment of Bruce's worst fears for Dick. He doesn't have faith in Dick's ability to resist her, as Dick lacks control of his emotions. Bruce wrongly tries to have him dismiss them rather than control and understand them. It's only when Alfred gives Bruce his last words of advice that Bruce finally understands. He can't control everything and everyone. He needs to have trust in Dick and in humanity. He needs to have hope. He needs Bruce Wayne. Bruce even restores Freeze's humanity by revealing to him that Nora is still alive. He gives Freeze an opportunity for redemption. He has faith in his villain, and he's rewarded. Freeze proved that he is still human. He still had compassion for his fellow man. It was Ivy who completely lost any connection to her former self. Man killed her, and Mother Nature resurrected her. She was willing to murder innocent lives in order to execute her plans. Ivy is the irredeemable villain, while Freeze is more of the criminal out of necessity. It can be argued that he doesn't kill anyone since it's established that they can be thawed and survive. Ivy murdered several people, all men in a position of power. Ivy, Freeze, and Bruce have all been powerless at one point or another. Ivy was powerless in her lab, Freeze was powerless against his wife's disease, and Bruce was powerless in that valley. Now they have power. Alfred has seen what power can do. He's seen how it can corrupt and destroy, but he's also seen how it can build and save. In the end, Alfred has hope that Bruce will use his power responsibly. The adaptations of the characters are pretty solid all around. My favorite performances were from Thurman and Michael Gall. They really added life to the characters. Arnold, I felt, added too much life. The constant puns were a bit much. Apparently before Arnold was hired, the script gave Freeze much more of a Shakespearean delivery. There are moments where those lines can be heard but are powered on with more puns. His best moments are the ones where he is depressed. He sits in his sorrows. Arnold definitely could have played a cold, almost mechanical villain with a thin level of sadness. They obviously based the character on the version from Batman the Animated Series. If it was just a straight adaptation, then I think the character would have been perfect. But this is Schumacher's Mr. Freeze, so that's the one we're gonna get. He really does shine in the end though, after he's lost any remorse for society. The moments where he's nearly dying are incredible. it shows the horrors of the character, his dependence on the cold, similar to Nora's, and without it he is doomed. Also, his final scene is terrific. Kinda backtracks a bit with his previous scene, but it's so good that I'll let it slide. The puns actually work. Uma did the best to differentiate between her dual identities. She made them contrast in such major ways, but it was believable that they were the same person. Ivy just being a more confident and sexier version of Isley, a real nerd without glasses type of change. She retained her same passions and drive. Her rebirth didn't change her, it just gave her the power to act on her previous desires. Her performance was enchanting. She played into the pulp theatrics, almost like a character from Batman 66. They managed to walk the line with her character. She wasn't just a pin-up. She was a competent femme fatale that had her victories. They made Bane just be Ivy's muscle. I don't think he even needed to be in the movie. Ivy could have moved along just fine with her own abilities. The adaptation is shallow, but at least this version of the character is Latinx in the story. Barbara Wilson. Alicia Silverstone does fine with what she's given. Her character is rebellious with a facade of the goody two-shoes, but she's ultimately good-hearted. That is interesting. It would have worked if she was the daughter of the police commissioner. She offers some assistance to Dick's character. He's forced to be the responsible one in their relationship, but that's never fully developed. I like the arc that they gave Dick. He's close to college age, although he was already like 20 when Bruce adopted him. He's learning to be responsible and independent. O'Donnell captures that energy of a young adult who has so much to prove and feels like he's being restrained. I think in the end they could have given him better moments to show his growth, though the moment with Ivy is well done. Bruce's final plea with Dick shows him that they are partners, that they are finally equals. Dick is finally recognized by Bruce as an adult, as his own person. Clooney's performance as Bruce Wayne / Batman is a bit flat. There's no real distinction between the two identities. He tries to give Bruce a bit of his own natural charm, but it doesn't really come together. I do think that he does well enough to portray the arc of the character. He had a love interest that I don't think was needed for the story. Their relationship just shows how Bruce is losing his connection to the world around him. I think that there was potential for the character and the story to focus on Bruce Wayne. Freeze and Ivy's issues stem from the lack of financial stability. It would have been interesting to see the theme of the Batman role, that is, class structure. Bruce represents the two-faced philanthropic conglomerate, while Freeze and Ivy are the environment. Whether the environment is literal or more metaphorical. The environment of Gotham could be pollution, or the high number of financially destitute and mentally and physically ill citizens who are left to fend for themselves, while people like Bruce Wayne live in luxury. It still would have connected with the theme that Bruce Wayne can do good, and that there's more to him than Batman. Clooney's best scenes were with Alfred. They gave Alfred the best lines, and Michael Gold delivers them perfectly. There's a sense of wisdom and hope, a true parental figure in Bruce's life. This movie is guilty of wasted potential. The studio wanted a toy commercial. Schumacher and everyone creatively involved accepted the terms and gave the studio their vision. They at least kept a level of artistic integrity that can be felt in the movie. This movie is not perfect. It can be easy to argue that's the worst in the franchise. Not everyone gave their best effort, but it was all good enough to make a young kid fall in love with the character of Batman. There are many ways to interpret this decades-old character, and this is certainly one of them. I love the grim portrayals of the Dark Knight, but I hope that the campiness of the Caped Crusader is never forgotten.
Hey, that light at the end of the tunnel, guess what? That's not heaven. I'm getting you, I'm getting you. That's the sea train.